Bibles open at Revelation chapters 4 and 5, because that's what we'll be looking at. One of the books that I've been reading this year is a diary of a man named David Brainerd. David Brainerd was an 18th century American missionary who ministered the gospel to Native Americans. Now, you may be thinking that reading a diary is not awfully captivating, because after all, a diary is not a highlights package, it's ordinary everyday life. But one particular diary entry stopped me in my tracks. Listen to what David Brainerd wrote on the night of his 24th birthday. Tuesday, April 20. This day I am 24 years of age. Oh, how much mercy have I received the year past? How often has God caused his goodness to pass before me? And how poorly have I answered the vows I made this time last year, to be wholly the Lord's, to be forever devoted to his service. The Lord help me to live more to his glory for the time to come. And then he goes on to say, had a most fervent wrestle with the Lord tonight for my enemies, and I hardly ever so long to live to God and to be altogether devoted to him. I wanted to wear out my life in his service and for his glory. Now, for those of you who are over the age of 24, I wonder what you wished for on your 24th birthday. For those of you who are under the age of 24, I wonder where you see your life going when you hit that age. David Brainerd, on the night of his 24th birthday, with a whole life still ahead of him, a whole life. What does David Brainerd pray for? What does he want more than anything in the world for his life? And he says, I want to wear out my life in God's service and for his glory. Isn't that remarkable? Now, what would cause a man or a woman to want to live such a life? What would cause us to want to wear out our lives in God's service and for his glory? And the answer, I think, is found in Revelation chapters 4 and 5. For these chapters invite us to see history and the future of our world from a different perspective, and that is the perspective of heaven. And once you have this perspective, everything changes. It's what drives us forward in life, and it's what keeps us going in life. I wonder if you hit the age of 72, like our brother Gary, what would have kept you going? Well, in chapter 4, John is given a vision of heaven, and the first thing he sees is a throne. Have a look at chapter 4, verse 2. John says, At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, with one seated on the throne. When you walk into a room, the first thing your eyes are drawn to is the centerpiece of the room. The centerpiece is the most dominant thing in the room, and it tells you a lot about a room. So if you walk into a room and you see a big lounge, that room is for lounging. If you walk into a room, you see a dining table with dining chairs, it tells you the room is for dining. When John walks through the door of heaven, the first thing he sees is a throne upon which God is seated. It's actually mentioned 17 times in chapters 4 and 5 alone. The throne of God is the centerpiece of heaven. Now, what does this tell us about heaven then? It tells us that heaven is the place where God is king. In other words, heaven is not primarily about us and our comfort, which is often how we think about heaven. Actually, heaven is primarily about God and his kingship. We're included in that, but first and foremost, heaven is about God and his kingship. And this is where our eyes are fixed as we read this chapter. In verse 3, God is described as having the appearance of jasper and carnelian. These precious stones represent God's majesty. You'll see that around the throne there was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. Now, where else in the Bible is there a rainbow? in the book of Genesis, after the great flood. This rainbow was a sign of God's promise never to judge the world in this way again. And so the rainbow represents God's mercy. In verse 5, there is lightning and thunder. This reminds us of God's appearance to Israel at Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19. And in this chapter, as God prepares to reveal himself and appear to his people, the people were warned to keep their distance, lest they perish before the holiness of God. The lightning and thunder represent God's holiness. And you'll see that in verse 5, before the throne, there are 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. If you've been with us in these past few weeks, going through this book of Revelation, you'll remember that 7 is the biblical number for completeness or perfection. And so the 7 torches and the 7 spirits, these represent the completeness of God's presence. And in verse 6, there is before the throne there is a sea of glass. Not an actual sea, but a sea of glass, like crystal. In the Bible, the sea represents the forces of chaos. And so when we see a sea of glass here, like crystal, that represents God's complete control over the forces of chaos. They are at his feet before the throne. Now pause for a moment to just take that all in. Because this vision of God's throne is overwhelming in its description. It's like moving from a dark room into the sunlight. You're immediately kind of taken aback. But it's more than that. It's like looking directly into the sunlight as you come out of that dark room. It's overwhelming. There's light and crystal and reflection and lightning and thunder, and it's all happening at once. Now, we need to remind ourselves that the book of Revelation is written in a particular genre. It's called apocalyptic genre. This means it uses highly symbolic language. We don't read apocalyptic genre in the same way we would read a letter or a newspaper report. They're different. This uses symbolic language. So I don't think we're meant to read this chapter as if this is literally what the throne of God looks like. Any more than when we come to chapter 5, we're meant to think of Jesus as being literally a lamb. We're reading apocalyptic literature. However, that doesn't mean that what it portrays here through symbolism is unreflective of the heavenly reality, which is that God's heavenly reign is glorious and breathtaking and overwhelming and incomparable. In the same way that everything in a room is placed around the centerpiece, did you notice that everything in heaven finds their place around the throne of God? Did you notice that? How everything in heaven is revolving around the throne? So have a look at verse 4. It says that around the throne were 24 thrones and 24 elders sitting on those thrones. If the 12 patriarchs represent the Old Testament people of God, and the 12 apostles represent the New Testament people of God, the 24 elders appear to be heavenly beings who represent the complete people of God. And have a look at verses 6 to 8. You'll see that around the throne there are also 4 living creatures. There's one like an ox, one like a lion, one like a man, and one like an eagle. 4 in the Bible is the number representing the completeness of creation. The completeness of creation. As when the Bible talks about the 4 corners of the earth. Well, here we have the 4 living creatures. These appear to be heavenly beings who represent all animate life throughout creation. These 4 living creatures are full of eyes in front and behind. And with all these eyes, they see something of God. And what they see is the eternal nature of God's reign. Which is why in verse 8, they never cease to say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was, and who is to come. They worship God, as do the 24 elders. Notice that the 24 elders are powerful beings in themselves. They're seated on their own thrones, and they each have a golden crown on their head. But even they, before the throne of God, have a look at verse 10. Even they fall down before God, and they cast their crowns before the throne, because no one compares, for God created all things. A few weeks ago, I went with my wife Shruva to see Sculptures by the Sea. I wonder if you had a chance to go to Bondi and to have a look at the sculptures there. I took a photo of my favorite sculpture. Now, I'm not particularly appreciative of art, nor am I an Instagram user, but I did take this photo. This is my favorite sculpture, a fish hook going through and underneath the path. And I will confess to you that in order to take this photo, with no one disrupting my photo, I had to sprint. When I saw a gap in the crowd, I sprinted. And then, so I sprinted ahead, I got ready to take the photo, and then Shruva starts walking into the picture. I'm like, Shruva, get out of the way. And that's the final product. Now, what happens after Sculptures by the Sea is over? What happens to this sculpture? What happens to all the sculptures? Well, the artist decides its future because it belongs to the artist. In the same way, God decides the future of his creation. For he created all things, and by his will they existed and were created. And God decides the future of his creation because he was and is to come. Now, for John's original readers, because this book was written in the 1st century, what would have the future look like for them? Well, it would have probably looked like the future was decided by the mighty Roman Empire. They lived under the rule of the Roman Empire, and it would have looked like the future belonged to the Romans. But of course, we know now that Roman Empire is ancient history. What about us today? Who does it look like the future belongs to? Who owns the future? Is it the superpowers of our world? Is it the big tech companies of Silicon Valley who own the internet? Is it the mega rich, those with deep pockets? Is it the cultural progressives? Think about the Qatar World Cup. Who owns the future? Those with deep pockets or those who wear rainbow armbands? Who owns the future? But when we step through the doors of heaven, what do we see? We see one who created all things. We see one forever seated on the throne of heaven. We see one who reigns over all history. As one Christian writer puts it, God has not retired from his throne. He initiated history and is still very much in charge of it, in spite of what appearances sometimes suggest. The future belongs to God. He decides it. Raises the question then, how does God carry out his sovereign plan for history? And how can God's people, if you're someone who trusts in Jesus and follows him, how can you be confident that the unfolding of his plan will finally result in your redemption? Well, that's where chapter 5 comes in. Chapter 5, the camera kind of zooms in, as it were, to the right hand of God to reveal a scroll sealed with 7 seals. Now, what is this scroll or book, and what's inside it? We're going to see what happens when the scroll is opened in chapters 6 and 8. But before we turn there next week, it's important to know, for now, that the background is found in the Old Testament book of Daniel. This book was written 500 years before Revelation. So 500 years before John receives his vision here, Daniel received a vision about a time in the future when God will establish his everlasting kingdom. And when God establishes his kingdom, what's going to happen is that God is also going to judge his enemies and is going to rescue his people and bring them into his kingdom. But when we get to the last chapter in the book of Daniel, in chapter 12, verse 4, Daniel is commanded to shut up the words and to seal the book or the scroll, to seal it until the time of the end. In other words, the scroll is God's plan for human history. And in this scroll is written how things will end for those who belong to God and for those who reject God. 500 years after Daniel, John sees a scroll with 7 seals. It's the same scroll. But in verse 3, no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. Which is why John weeps in verse 4. John weeps not because he can't have a sneaky peek into the scroll. John weeps because he knows that Christians in the first century are suffering. We saw this last week in chapters 2 and 3, which are the 7 letters to 7 churches in Asia Minor. You remember that the churches that were suffering for their faith were commended, and then they were urged to persevere in their faith in Jesus. While the churches that were compromising their faith in order to avoid suffering, well, they were rebuked and commanded to repent. And you'll remember that each of these 7 letters, had something in common. They all closed with a promised reward for those who do remain faithful. And the repeated refrain was, to the one who conquers, Jesus says, I will give, or I will make, or I will grant you this. So have a look at chapter 3, verse 21. Same page, chapter 3, verse 21. Jesus said, the one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. John weeps because he knows Christians are suffering, but no one is able to unlock God's plan for history. No one is able to unlock the day when God will judge his enemies and rescue his people from their suffering. But then in verse 5, one of the elders says to John, weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. A few weeks ago, Taronga Zoo made headlines all over the world. Do you know what I'm talking about? When a pride of lions escaped from their enclosure and then sent the zoo into lockdown because, for good reason, right? Because lions are powerful and strong and dangerous. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment that not a pride of lions has escaped from the enclosure, but a flock of lambs. Do you think that would have made international headlines? Probably not. Because lambs are weak and very much non-life-threatening. Now, what John hears from the elder is that the Lion of Judah has conquered. But when John turns to look in verse 6, what he sees is not a lion, but a lamb standing as though it had been slain. The lamb represents the crucified and risen Jesus. Crucified because the lamb was slain, resurrected because the lamb is now standing. Now, it's not the prettiest looking lamb, is it? But remember, it's not literal. This is apocalyptic genre. It's symbolic. And what the lamb's appearance symbolizes is divine sovereignty. And so the 7 horns in verse 6 represent complete strength. The 7 eyes represent complete wisdom. And the 7 spirits of God, as we've already seen, represents the complete presence of God. You see, it depends on what perspective you look at life and the world. In history, from the perspective of the world, Jesus looks like a pathetic and slaughtered lamb. But in heaven, he stands victorious over death and sovereign over all history. Which is why there is a new song in heaven. In verse 9, they sang a new song. Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God, from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth. Through his death and resurrection, Jesus has unlocked God's end-time plan, a plan which culminates in the redemption of God's people from all nations and the vindication of their faith. They have not suffered in vain. In a hostile and ever-changing world, it can be very tempting to compromise or to give up the Christian faith for fear of finding ourselves on the wrong side of history. Well, this vision is an assurance to Christians, not simply that the future belongs to God who is seated on the throne, but that their future belongs with God. For there stands in heaven not just the throne of God, but the crucified Lamb who was conquered. And so their future belongs with God. What happens then when we see the world and the history of the world from this perspective? When we see the triumph of the crucified Lamb, what happens when we see that Jesus is the one who holds the future and our future in his hands? Well, the command to John in verse 5 is weep no more. When we look around us, there appears to be no future for Christians. We see the decline of the church in our country. We see the Bible's teaching being cancelled when it doesn't align with our culture's values. And sadly, we see the Bible's teaching being cancelled by the church itself in an attempt to get with culture. We see Christians in the workplace being pressured to conform. And we see Christians forced out of their jobs when they refuse to compromise on their faith. Do you share in John's grief? The grief he felt when no one was able to open the scroll. Well, weep no more. But behold, weep no more is not saying, pull yourself together, man up. It's not saying that. It's saying there's no need to despair. There's no need to despair when we see the Lamb who gave himself for us and who has conquered through death and who reigns over all history and who promises to grant us to sit with him on his throne. So weep no more. And when we see this, the crucified Lamb sitting on the throne of heaven, then heaven's worship becomes our worship. In 2005, the late American author David Foster Wallace delivered the commencement address at Kenyon College. In his speech, he cuts to the heart of the human condition. This is what he said in his speech. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what we worship. And he goes on to list some of the gods of our world that we might find ourselves worshipping, like money and things, or our body and beauty. So I guess the question is, of all the things that we could possibly worship in this world, and there are many, of all the gods that we could worship, why on earth would we choose to worship Jesus and choose only to worship Jesus? What would cause us to want to wear out our lives? However many years there are left, or however many years there are to go, what will cause us to want to wear out our lives in his service and for his glory? Or a vision of God seated on the throne, and a vision of the crucified Lamb who has conquered, together reigning over all history. That would do it. For when we see that, we can't. Indeed, we won't be satisfied with living for anything less. Would you live for anything else less than the God who reigns over all history? There is simply no one else worthy of our loyalty, our service, and our worship. And so, brothers and sisters, let us join in heaven's worship and proclaim, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. Amen.